she turned away from him. At the exact moment he needed her most. History calls it cowardice. Some call it survival. No one has ever been able to call it anything for certain. This is the story of the trust that broke, and no one can prove why. Welcome to the Judas Archives. If you're here at 2 a.m. again, pull up a chair. Let's sit with this one together. We are taught that betrayal always wears a familiar face, that it comes from someone standing close enough to hurt us. But some of history's greatest tragedies were never betrayals of the heart at all. They were betrayals engineered from a distance, by men who never needed to love you, only needed the world to believe a lie about you. Tonight, we sail into the golden harbor of ancient Alexandria to dissect the anatomy of history's most enduring tragedy, the fall of a queen named Cleopatra and the Roman general who loved her, Mark Antony. Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. She ruled Egypt not through inherited weakness, but through fierce intelligence, fluent in 9 languages, schooled in politics, philosophy, and the delicate art of survival. She had already outmaneuvered rivals, murdered relatives, and seduced the most powerful man in Rome, Julius Caesar himself, just to keep her throne. When Caesar was murdered in Rome, power split 3 ways among his surviving allies. One of them, a battle-hardened general named Mark Antony, traveled to Egypt to question Cleopatra's loyalty. He arrived expecting a political meeting. He left entirely undone. She arrived to meet him dressed as the goddess Venus herself, aboard a barge with golden sails and silver oars, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids. It was theater, calculated entirely to overwhelm, and it worked completely. Antony, one of Rome's most feared military commanders, was captivated instantly. What began as political theater slowly became something else entirely. Antony stayed in Alexandria for months, neglecting his duties in Rome, drawn deeper into Cleopatra's world, and Cleopatra, a woman who had spent her entire life using powerful men to survive, found herself, for the first time, genuinely attached to one. Word of Antony's transformation spread quickly back to Rome. The disciplined general, they said, had abandoned his armor for Egyptian robes, his duty for pleasure, his own people for a foreign queen. In the cold marble halls of the Roman Senate, a very different kind of war was quietly beginning to take shape. That war had a face and a name: Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, a man barely in his 20s, but already possessing a political mind colder and more patient than any general's blade. Octavian did not need to defeat Antony in battle. He only needed Rome to stop loving him first. Octavian understood something Antony never fully grasped. In Rome, perception was a weapon far sharper than any sword. He began a quiet, patient campaign, framing Antony not as a rival general, but as a Roman who had been bewitched, seduced, and stolen away by a foreign queen with dangerous ambitions of her own. Rumors were engineered and spread with precision that Cleopatra intended to rule Rome herself through Antony, that Antony had willed Roman territories to her children, that he intended to move Rome's capital to Alexandria entirely. Some of it held fragments of truth. Most of it was carefully, deliberately exaggerated. In Alexandria, none of this reached them with any real urgency. Antony and Cleopatra had built a life together, had children together, and in a lavish ceremony called the Donations of Alexandria, Antony publicly granted vast territories to Cleopatra and their children, a gesture of love that Octavian would soon transform into evidence of treason. Octavian's final move was his most ruthless. He obtained, or claimed to obtain, Antony's private will, sealed and kept with the Vestal Virgins, and read it aloud before the entire Senate. Whether every word was authentic no longer mattered. The damage, once spoken aloud, could never be undone. The will, real or altered, declared that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome, to a deeply patriotic Roman public. This was unforgivable. Octavian said nothing further. He simply let the outrage do what months of careful propaganda had been building toward all along. Rome formally declared war, not on Mark Antony directly, but on Cleopatra herself. It was a deliberate legal and political maneuver, allowing Octavian to frame the coming conflict not as another brutal Roman civil war, but as a united defense against a foreign queen who threatened to conquer Rome from within. Antony and Cleopatra prepared to meet Octavian's forces at sea, off the coast of Actium in western Greece. Cleopatra insisted on commanding her own fleet personally, a decision some of Antony's Roman officers deeply resented. Trust, by this point, had already begun quietly cracking beneath the surface of their alliance. The Battle of Actium began at dawn, hundreds of warships colliding in chaos and fire. For hours, the outcome hung completely uncertain, and then, at the exact moment Antony needed her most, Cleopatra's fleet suddenly turned and left the battle entirely. What that moment actually meant, history has never fully agreed on. No one has ever fully agreed on why she withdrew. Some say it was cowardice, others say it was always the plan, a calculated retreat to preserve her fleet for a longer war. What is certain is this: Antony, seeing her ships pull away, abandoned his own command entirely and followed her. Whatever his reasons, the choice was catastrophic. His remaining soldiers, abandoned mid-battle by the very commander they trusted, watched their formation collapse into confusion. Octavian's propaganda, the story of a general who chose a foreign queen over Rome itself, had just written its own final devastating proof. They returned to Alexandria defeated, their combined forces shattered, their allies deserting them by the day. Antony, once one of Rome's most celebrated generals, withdrew into isolation, drinking heavily, avoiding even Cleopatra's company for long stretches at a time. Cleopatra, ever the survivor, quietly began preparing contingencies of her own. Historical accounts suggest she tested poisons on condemned prisoners, searching for one that would bring a painless death, should surrender to Octavian ever become her only remaining option. The servants moved quietly through the halls, avoiding eye contact, aware that something in their fortunes had already shifted. Outside the walls, Octavian's army continued its slow, patient advance, each day drawing closer, each day making the inevitable a little harder to ignore. Octavian's forces reached the gates of Alexandria itself. Antony, against all realistic odds, prepared for one final battle, perhaps as much to reclaim his honor as to actually win. His remaining soldiers, sensing the inevitable, began deserting to Octavian's side in growing numbers. A false rumor reached Antony, one that would prove fatal, that Cleopatra, facing capture, had already taken her own life. It was not true, but Antony, consumed entirely by grief, believed it instantly, and without hesitation, drew his sword against himself. The wound was not immediately fatal. Word reached Cleopatra that Antony, believing her already dead, had turned his blade against himself. She rushed to him, horrified, realizing that a lie meant to protect her had instead driven the man she loved to a fatal, irreversible act. He was brought to her, still alive but fading quickly, and died in her arms inside her fortified mausoleum. His final words, according to ancient accounts, urged her to make peace with Octavian if she could, but only in a way that preserved her honor and safety. She held him and watched the empire they had built together die alongside him. Octavian's forces finally took the palace, and Cleopatra, devastated but far from broken, was taken into custody. Octavian himself came to see her, not out of compassion, but to assess whether she could still be useful, paraded alive through Rome as the ultimate symbol of his victory. Cleopatra understood immediately what Octavian intended for her: to be dragged through the streets of Rome in chains, a living trophy, proof of his total victory over both a general and a queen. She had spent her entire life refusing to be anyone's trophy. She was not about to start now. Tradition holds that a basket of figs was delivered to her chamber, smuggled inside it a venomous snake. Even the ancient historians who recorded this, writing decades after her death, admitted they weren't entirely certain it was true. What we do know is that she dismissed her attendants, dressed in her full royal regalia one final time, and prepared to meet death entirely on her own terms. However it actually happened, she chose her own ending, rather than allow Rome to write it for her. The queen who had ruled through intelligence, seduction, and sheer force of will, refused, even in death, to become anyone else's symbol of conquest. When Octavian's soldiers finally broke into her chamber, they found her already gone, dressed in full royal regalia, her most loyal attendants having chosen to die alongside her rather than survive without her. The Queen Octavian had planned to parade through Rome, had escaped him entirely. Octavian, the master strategist who had engineered this entire tragedy from a distance, was left with a victory that felt, even to him, somehow incomplete. He had won Egypt, won Rome, won everything he had calculated for. But the two people whose destruction he had spent years designing had denied him the ending he wanted most. Octavian returned to Rome not merely victorious, but transformed. Within a few short years, he would become Augustus, Rome's first true emperor, ending the Republic entirely and beginning an empire that would last centuries. The cold calculation that destroyed a love story had also, quietly, built an empire. Egypt, one of the oldest and richest civilizations in the ancient world, became a Roman province almost overnight. The independence Cleopatra had spent her entire reign fighting fiercely to protect ended within days of her death, swallowed entirely into the empire that had engineered her destruction. Octavian, to his own quiet surprise, allowed Cleopatra to be buried beside Antony, honoring at least one of her final requests. Even Rome's coldest strategist it seems, understood that some stories deserve to end with a measure of grace, even after everything that had been engineered to destroy them. Historians have debated Cleopatra's legacy for 2,000 years, often reduced by Roman writers to little more than a seductress who corrupted a great general. But the woman who ruled Egypt through intelligence and sheer force of will, who chose her own death over another man's victory, deserves a far more complicated legacy than the one her enemies wrote for her. Much of ancient Alexandria, including parts of Cleopatra's own palace, now lies submerged beneath the harbor's calm waters, a quiet, physical reminder of just how completely an empire and a love story can vanish beneath the surface of history. If you are sitting in the quiet tonight, wondering whether someone you trusted chose themselves over you, remember Cleopatra's fleet turning away at Actium. We will never know for certain if it was fear, strategy, or the oldest betrayal of all, loving someone completely, right up until survival asked her to choose. The mind can always find a reason to walk away right when someone needs you most. The heart never stops asking whether it was betrayal or just survival. Their empire fell, but the question she left behind, somehow, never has. Thank you for spending another night in the archives. If this story brought you comfort, leave a broken heart emoji below and subscribe to join our quiet community. Until we meet again in the dark, see you next time. You are not alone. Goodbye.